Hello, this is Jonathan, the editor of Conter, the cross-party site for Scottish anti-capitalists, and host of the Conter podcast, or ConterCast. This is the second full podcast we've run on the site in association with Sunny Govern Radio. This is also my last podcast, I'm afraid to say. I'm moving on to pastures new in the new year. So I suppose this is just a quick message to thank everybody who's contributed this year and helped make Conter such an amazing space. It's a project I've been very, very passionate about managing and pushing forward with the help of my amazing sort of editorial team and regular contributors. I'm speaking like it's ending. Conter will continue. We're going to have a new editor in the new year, and in the meantime, the editorial team will be stewarding things along. But I just wanted to leave a message of thanks to everybody who supported and helped the site really build from nothing when we started into something which I think has become a really useful resource, I hope, for people, whether it's for commentary, activism, debating, whatever they feel passionately about. So, yeah, thank you very much for that. On this podcast, we talk about Brexit, that lovely subject that everybody wants to talk about. And our guests, Jonathon Shafi and Kirsty Haigh, I think do marvellously well articulating two different viewpoints, but with both with very coherent analysis. Obviously, this is a very sensitive issue for some people, and people get very sort of passionate about it. And obviously, we did want to go on longer than just under an hour, which is what we could manage for studio space. But I think with something like this, we could have spoke for all day. So, I mean, if anybody does have any major contributions or things they want to add or questions they want to ask, obviously, email's always open, editor@conter.co.uk. And yeah, I'll stop waffling and let you enjoy the show. Cheers. Hello, you're listening to ConterCast with me, Jonathan Rimmer. This is a periodic podcast that we do for the site Conter. That's conter.co.uk. We're a cross-party site for Scottish anti-capitalists. This is the second debate that we've run here in association with Sunny Govern. They're very kindly letting us use their studio once more. You may have heard us September, October, I'm trying to think when we last did it, but it was a debate all around sort of Labour's relevance and going forward in Scotland in relation to independence and a whole other sort of number of things. But this one is probably an even more divisive topic that we're tackling today. People did vote for this on the site, on our Twitter, that they wanted us to discuss this. You've asked for it, but I know a lot of people will probably have very strong opinions on this subject. On this, to discuss this with me today, we have Jonathon Shafi and Kirsty Haigh. How are you doing, guys?
Hello, thanks for having us.
Hi, yeah, great, thanks.
Jonathan, first, could you just quickly introduce yourself and what kind of work you do?
Yeah, my name's Jonathon Shafi. I've been involved in various campaigns over probably the last 10 years or so. I helped to co-found the Radical Independence campaign in 2012, which campaigned during the Scottish referendum, of course. And I am involved in various, campaigns and movements since then. I write a lot about the far right, about European politics and about foreign policy. And thanks for inviting us on.
No problem. Kirsty, thanks for coming on as well. Could you quickly introduce yourself and what you get up to?
Hi, so I'm Kirsty Haigh. Since the summer, I've been the Scotland Organiser for Another Europe is Possible. So we're the kind of left-wing anti-Brexit campaign group. We started before the Brexit referendum to campaign from the kind of left-wing angle, pro-migrants, against the kind of neoliberal bodies and institutions, campaign around how we could stay in the EU and make it much better and something. And since then, it's become a kind of campaign where at the moment we're calling for another referendum on the Brexit deal to try and re-engage people in the issue and do it from a left-wing perspective, which has been kind of missed from a lot of the mainstream campaigns.
Fantastic. That's sort of answered what I'm going to ask you again very soon, so sorry about that. Sort of what your positions are, we'll go into more broadly in a minute. I suppose, first of all, just to explain to listeners the sort of nature of this debate because of what Conter is. I mean, both of our, both Jonathon and Kirsty debated tonight are, as you heard, very much on the left. This isn't really a left v right kind of debate, although that kind of ends up being quite skewed when it comes to Brexit anyway, for obviously obvious reasons. So they're both going to be presenting arguments where you guys will inevitably agree with each other on some things, but your analysis will be slightly different and your conclusions will be different. And I suppose the reason we're very keen to have this debate now, I suppose there are a huge number of debates of issues people want to discuss, and I know people are often quite tired and sick of talking about Brexit, but I suppose over the past few weeks it's really come to a head. A lot of what's going on in terms of Theresa May's Brexit deal and what comes next is going to have huge ramifications for the country, and it's something that the left in particular does not necessarily have a coherent response on. So I suppose to kind of quickly summarise before I ask you guys your kind of positions on this, where we are. I mean, as of an hour ago, things have moved on even more dramatically. So Theresa May delayed her vote on the Brexit deal. I think she's now announced it will be January 14th. She's not had a good go of it over the past month or so. She was found in contempt of Parliament. Obviously, the Tory party the ERG group, as they call it, the sort of hard right Brexiteers in the party, tried to launch a coup against her, which she came out of relatively unscathed, but obviously a huge dent in sort of her leadership. And she's been having further conversations with the EU in terms of the Irish backstop, things like that, which refers to the open border on the island of Ireland and what that means if the UK leaves without an all-encompassing deal. But the deal itself looks like it may well be voted down in the new year, or when we do eventually get this debate in Parliament. Now, obviously, from a left perspective, there is numerous sort of approaches we can take to this, and we're going to hear sort of differing sort of solutions tonight. But I suppose, looking quickly at sort of what Labour's sort of options are, Jeremy Corbyn tonight, it seems, has tabled a vote of no confidence in Theresa May herself, which could be hugely symbolic, but not in the government, so it's unlikely to trigger a general election, which is what Labour's preferred option is, or preferred option. And a people's vote, which would be a second referendum, or at least more specifically a referendum on Theresa May's deal, is another option that's been mooted. Basically, people have very sort of differing positions on this, not just across the political spectrum, but specifically on the left, because it's something that arguably we didn't hear very coherently in 2016. It seemed to be very two sort of business-led campaigns. And bearing that in mind, if I could just sort of ask both of you in turn, Jonathon first, if I could, what do you think the wider left, I'm not just talking about sort of Labour or the SNP, although I'll come into it, what do you think the wider left needs to be prioritising when it comes to Brexit over the coming, I was going to say months, but now, weeks as well?
Well, my view is that in England, the priority has to be to call for a general election and to push for a general election, and to do that not just in the Parliament but in the streets via demonstrations and other extra parliamentary action. I think you look at France just now, the streets have power because the institutions can't resolve the political crisis in which they find themselves. They can't resolve the economic questions which face ordinary people. That would be what I'd be advising there. I think in Scotland, I support the call for a general election, but I also think that now, precisely now, is the time, if ever there was a time, for the SNP to call for an independence referendum. I think, incidentally, that's how you resolve the Brexit question in Scotland, which of course voted Remain. But I do think it's important to say that there has been quite a lot missed out in all of the debate that we've had over the last number of months about what caused Brexit in the first place. And this is important because it wasn't Russia, as far as the Liberals are concerned. It's nothing to do with the society in which people live and the contradictions of that society. It's the Russians. It's not because of dark money, though that's an important issue, and one which everyone who's interested in transparent democratic politics has to pick up on. But this has been decades of neoliberalism, of austerity, of cuts to public services, coupled with the demonisation of immigrants that's come from not just the right-wing press, not just Nigel Farage. He's feeding off a wider feeling which stems from the British state and from successive governments, including Tony Blair's government. Of course, he's prominently calling for a second vote on his terms, which of course different to Kirsty's and others. Those issues have been put under the carpet. We have to ask why. And unless we ask those questions, we're never going to be able to resolve the fundamental element in society which has caused this crisis in the first place. And for me, that is the political and economic system that has dominated the UK for the last 4 decades. Now, Corbyn's offering a way out. Corbyn, in my opinion, is offering a completely overhauled economy, one which takes on the banks, which takes on the very richest in society. And my personal view is that can be conducted in the most transformative way possible if we are outside of the rules, regulations and stipulations from the European Union, and in particular the European Commission, which has no democratic oversight whatsoever.
And Kirsty, could you quickly sort of outline your position and how that differs from Jonathon's there?
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of what Jonathon said that I definitely agree with. I think the kind of analysis behind it and we've come through and things. But I suppose in terms of when we look at Brexit and what's going on, the situation and position of where we're at now, the kind of idea behind Lexit or any of these ideas, it's just a complete fantasy. That's not what we're being offered. It's not what we're going to get. And I don't think, there's too many people that will have to suffer and face the brunt of what's going to happen to kind of get to this kind of Lexit situation. In terms of when we look at the EU and what's happening with all of this right now, I'd say that it's still pretty clear that the best deal still happens to be in the EU. And that's, I would love to see a general election. Lots of us would. We would love to see Jeremy Corbyn's policies be implemented. But, the trade unions and the Labour Party itself and all of these groups have come out to say that these radical policies can still happen as members of the EU. Many of the most right-wing policies that we've seen been pushed through in the EU have been pushed through by the UK. So this kind of idea that we'll suddenly be part of a kind of more left-wing state by being outside of it, it just isn't true. So kind of for all those reasons, I suppose that I think that there has to be a kind of another referendum looking at Brexit and a kind of vote on the deal to say that what we have at the moment, what we're being offered, is a Tory hard right Brexit that is going to throw migrants under the bus and will devastate the kind of working classes.
I mean, so Kirsty alluded just there a little bit to, I suppose, what is a sort of a kind of a key argument against Lexit, which I suppose for listeners who aren't aware of that, a left-wing Brexit. I mean, I'm sure you worked out. But I mean, I suppose it's the argument that I suppose that that there's going to be short-term pain and it will inevitably sort of fall on the working classes, and I suppose as you were saying, Jonathon, there, sort of what Corbyn's position is here. He doesn't want to be restricted to these directives in the EU that, although technically wouldn't have prohibited their 27 manifesto, might sort of become a problem down the line. But the EU are saying, they're not negotiating any kind of new deal, whether it's May or Brexit, essentially. So at the end of the day, a lot of this is sort of quite hypothetical and tinkering. But your solution is that we should essentially break from the EU instead of trying to sort of come back and find a way to restore what we had before. You think for a socialist sort of new deal, or whatever you want to call it, something that would sort of enhance opportunities for a left-wing government in this country. I suppose. Are you saying that you're kind of aligned with Corbyn's sort of proposals on this? I mean, Because I suppose surely if you're implementing a socialist programme for government, how possible is that if they spend the first several months of their Corbyn's premiership, or whatever it might be, fighting the fires of Brexit, as it were, because inevitably, I think there was an article the other day by Laurie McFarlane on this, actually. He was talking a bit about sort of to what extent can we really insulate ourselves from global capital, even if we're run by a left-wing government? I mean, how do you square that as someone that's essentially arguing for a complete hard Brexit?
Which is what I'm arguing for as well. I mean, look, I think we have to work out, first of all, what the EU was set up for and what its job is. The EU is an agreement between ostensibly neoliberal states, between those states and the institutions that run capitalism, that maintain the unjust order that we live under today. And their job is to maximise profits via the single market, which of course was a Thatcherite invention. It's the lasting legacy of Thatcher across Europe, of course, is the single market, because it suppresses labour and maximises the power of those who own industries and so on. And their job, as well as maximising profit in that situation, is to suppress challenges that come from the left. We've seen this numerous times across different countries, and what the EU now is going to do, and this is my big fear and why I don't think that it's possible to reform it, is they're going to become more authoritarian, more anti-democratic, because of the political crisis which is taking place, not just here but across Europe. And they're also going to move further to the right on questions of immigration. So if you look at Tony Blair recently, he's talking about reforming freedom of movement. I think that they will have a very harsh regime when it comes to migration. They are not so concerned about white professionals moving around Europe. They are much more concerned, though, about immigration that comes from outside of Europe. And this, to me, mirrors and feeds the development of the far right across Europe, where in Germany, the AfD, the far right, option there is in the official opposition. In France, Le Pen, just a couple of years ago, polled 11 million votes. So the idea that Britain is in some way unique, I think is wrong when it comes to looking at the crisis across Europe. So my solution is that the European Union needs to be opposed by a pan-European movement of the left that constructs new institutions in the vein of things like a Green New Deal.
Just quickly, because you talked about a pan-European movement there. I mean, I'll try and keep this brief as we can because we need to move on. But I mean, when you look at something like what Yanis Varoufakis has proposed, then I mean, he's of a similar mind in terms of combating the far right across Europe and all the rest of it. But he still advocated essentially what Kirsty's saying, another Europe is possible's line. Yeah. I mean, what's the disagreement there? Why not sort of come behind him on that?
Well, Varoufakis, I think his critique of the European Union is absolutely correct. I agree with him. People should read the book Adults in the Room if they want to find out how the EU run negotiations.
Yeah.
But his strategy in terms of overcoming the problems posed by the EU, I think, is flawed.
And just Kirsty, just to quickly let you come back on that as well. I mean, so Jonathon Shafi saying there that essentially for a socialist government to sort of come into power, a lot of this is down to political decisions, and that the EU actually restricts a lot of this sort of stuff, and it's to do with democracy. There's another point on that is when we're looking at the 2016 vote, I suppose a lot of people on the left will understand the sort of anxieties that people would have around, following through on Brexit, given the sort of rise in hate crime and all the rest of it, and the immigration side of it. But in terms of democracy, British people did vote to leave the EU. If we are going to have another vote on this, whether it's on the Brexit deal or whether it remains on it or not, that remains to be seen. But does that not risk undermining the democratic decision that people have made? And does that also not risk essentially turning the far right, Tommy Robinson and all the rest of it, into martyrs who can kind of spearhead this sort of quote-unquote campaign for respecting the democratic will of the people?
I mean, if we want to talk about kind of what can happen with the far right and whether or not they become martyrs, I mean, I think if you look at it at the moment, it's quite clear which side the far right are on, and they are on the side that's saying that they want Brexit to happen, and the situation that we are currently in is putting the far right and the likes of Tommy Robinson on the winning side, and I suppose that is what we're majorly saying that we have to combat. I think the European Union, EU, has a lot of problems. We talked about the fortress Europe and how problems of migration to do with that. But the solution to that isn't that we turn around and instead create a fortress Britain where we don't be part of what's going on, but we create our own inter-society. And the Brexit and what's going on is being built on the back of scapegoating migrants. I mean, that's very clear. It was one of the things that Theresa May really advocated on and wanted in the first page of the kind of Brexit deal that she's proposed. And in terms of, the whole democracy of another referendum around this, I think democracy is built on people being able to change their minds and change their opinions. And if I didn't agree with that, then there wouldn't be any point in being involved in any campaigns or anything that I'm part of, because the whole point is we're trying to change society's minds. And I think you can really see over the last few years that there has been so much more information, so much more debate, that there's been so much more discussion around this whole issue. And in light of, we can see society is very kind of polarised around this. I'm not at all advocating that we should just overturn Brexit and that nothing should happen, but that there should be another referendum where people have much greater understanding of what all this means, what is actually being offered to them, and are able to vote on that and make a kind of informed decision on that.
And what would the options, do you think? What do you think the options should be on the referendum?
Yeah, so I mean, that's lots of people have lots of different opinions. At Another Europe is Possible, we've been kind of advocating for 3 options on the ballot of you could vote for the deal, you could vote for no deal, or you could vote to remain. Other people have different opinions, but we feel that kind of best encompasses the fact that we've changed, we've had this information, you're getting to vote for actually what's on offer, what's not, but also respecting the fact that for a lot of people, neither of those options of the deal or no deal are good enough, and they see remotely fit the bill. And
just quickly, Jonathon, on that actually, if that was the 3 options on the ballot paper, Remain, Theresa May's Brexit deal, which from a leftist point of view undermines workers' rights and all the rest of it, or no deal and Britain essentially crashing out with nothing. With those 3 options,
just to take on the question more generally very quickly about a second referendum, I agree with Kirsty that democracy is a process, that democracy is something that doesn't happen overnight. But I think there are a few questions that we have to pose around the notion of a second referendum. The first is what the question would be. Now, there's no agreement about that, so that is, of course, a big stumbling block. Secondly, we have to understand that, look, what's happened since 2016 has been that Theresa May has been fighting, alongside the whole of the establishment, a rearguard action against Brexit, alongside the European Union. So the European Union have form in this. When they receive a vote that they don't like, they will construct a deal which forces a political crisis and which then in turn forces another referendum. So we have to be careful about the choreography of this. We have to be careful about saying things like, now we have the information. Well, now we have the information given to us as a result of a series of interactions which have been geared against the UK leaving the EU. That's the first point. Secondly, and lastly, I think that a second referendum will not solve any of these questions. If it is leave versus remain, I think the result would be very close. If it is, as Kirsty points out, the 3 options, I think that immediately has a problem, because the leave vote would be split between May's deal and no deal. You may end up with a majority of people who don't support Remain, but they might be on the losing end because Remain has more than the other 2 options. I don't think that is a settlement which can last. And very lastly, I think the dynamic of a second referendum would be very different. I watched a Leave Means Leave campaign rally a couple of days ago. It's a right-wing rally, but interestingly, Nigel Farage is subordinating immigration, whereas he elevated it in 2016, to turn the narrative into the idea that it's the political elites, the CBI, the big businesses, the banks and so on, not people like Kirsty, but people like Tony Blair, who are trying to overturn 2016. I think that's how it will be pitched. And as we know from 2016, from Brexit, from Trump, from everything that's happened since, if you pitch a campaign against the political class, against the elites, then I think it's in with a good chance of winning. So I don't see it resolving anything, and I see it leading to further polarisation and bad and negative consequences as a result.
Okay, so we might get, I suppose, onto what our responses would be more hypothetically in a bit. I suppose I kind of also want to refer to a point Kirsty made there as well. I mean, I suppose you're kind of, a key part of your analysis has been in your writing and stuff, Jonathon, in terms of, for Common Space and elsewhere, has been that the forces behind the people's vote, obviously not referring to another Europe as possible,
no,
principally come from the neoliberal centre, or essentially, they want to protect the establishment as it is and as it has been until this moment of rupture. But as Kirsty was saying, the people that have been spearheading Brexit are the xenophobic far right. And in terms of who we want to be bedfellows with in a lot of this sort of stuff, it's not something that the left has necessarily been able to spearhead or come to much sort of a unified position on, simply because they've not been the decision makers in this process. So I mean, I suppose even irrespective of kind of the sort of potential economic costs you have if Britain does become less of an attractive place for migrants, or if it's restricted entirely, I mean, would like a kind of hard Brexit as you've envisaged not kind of exacerbate this further and lead to further hate crime and a further feeling of a hostile environment, which is what the Conservative government have been enforcing for God knows how long?
Sure, well, very quickly, because I know there's lots to say about this from both Kirsty and I.
Yeah.
Very quickly, I think that when it comes down to the frame that you've just put, this gets to really the core of the argument. We are living through a protracted political crisis across Europe. It's not going to go away, regardless of Brexit. It's going to continue for a long time. There's another financial crisis which will overlap this. And it's important, from my perspective, that the left is independent, both of the liberal centre and of the far right. If we are seen to be connected with or deferential to the liberal centre, then it means that the space for the far right to pitch themselves as the anti-establishment force in society is left open to those forces. That's why I think I'm not bothered about opposing the liberal centre over the question of Brexit. I would also say that a hard right Brexit, under the vision of people like Jacob Rees-Mogg and so on, doesn't actually work. What they're advocating is for a low regulation, low tax, low wage economy. And this is why I talked about the causes of Brexit and the Leave vote in the first place. Millions of working class people who voted Leave do not want that kind of society. They want to see their living standards improve, not get worse. And I think there's a huge opening for the left there, because only a left Brexit will actually work. Lastly, in terms of the question of migration, if you were to ask people in France, migrants in France, or in Germany, or in Italy, where Salvini is running quarter-to-quarter cleansing operations, in his own words, against migrants, then it's clear to me that this is a Europe-wide issue. It's not something specific to Brexit Britain. And therefore the question for the left is, how do you resolve that across Europe? For me, it's class unity. And it's not recasting the divisions over Brexit. It's about bringing people together against the system as a whole.
Did you want to come quickly back on that, just quickly, Kirsty?
I mean, I suppose that, I agree with the sort of things that Shafi is pitching, in that, yes, across Europe we have to unite and we have to do these things together, but they are, to me, very long term, in that isn't going to happen overnight, where Brexit is going to happen overnight. Mm-hmm. One of my Polish colleagues the other day put it very well when she said, if you're throwing migrants under the bus, it doesn't really matter if the bus is nationalised. And that's, I suppose, essentially a kind of summary of what's going to happen first, that migration is this massive problem at the moment, and yes, a lot of the EU migrants are people that are generally doing better out of it, but that doesn't mean that we should throw all of them under the bus with what's happening now and accept their fate in kind of this. And they're already it's become a massive problem with people not being able to stay. The threshold that they're talking about for EU migrants to stay is they'll have to earn 30,000. This is going to be ripping families and communities apart. And that, in terms of all of this in the wider society, that's just not a price that I'm willing to pay in terms of how this goes.
sorry, I'll come back to you just in a second, Jonathan. I just wanted to ask as well, Kirsty. Sure. I suppose what one point I suppose Jonathan will want to come back on the notion of throwing migrants under the bus, and I'll get to that. I think a key part of this argument as well, I suppose, depending on who has the levers of power, and if the argument that some on the sort of Lexit side might make, especially within Labour, would be that, well, Corbyn government, it's about political priorities, that would be a first point of priority, blah blah blah. And I suppose the anxiety some people have now at this point is that we've got a Brexit deal proposed by Theresa May. It means saving key elements of economic integration with Europe, but sacrificing key workers' rights. And I suppose the worry, for some Labour MPs who are more aligned with Corbyn and many activists as well, is that, I suppose, should the left really be uncomfortable when it comes to aligning ourselves with these forces, when I suppose the capitalist British state right now is in such a crisis? Is it not just sort of bowing to what the establishment for so long have been sort of, they want things to return to the way they are. There's a certain equilibrium there, and that, as Corbyn would say, as Jonathan would say, there might be a short-term cost perhaps to Brexit, but ultimately that's worth it for Britain to form a new path that will ultimately make it much easier to build a progressive consensus across the UK.
I mean, I suppose I would say that I disagree that I think it necessarily makes it much easier for us to become a progressive society, for a whole host of different reasons. But, there's no... The Brexit that we are facing, that will be the Brexit that happens, doesn't set the criteria for us to have a more progressive society at all. It's setting up a situation where our economy is going to become more deregulated, whereas the Trade Union Congress keep talking about, it's working families that are going to suffer the most. Our kind of environmental standards and working rights are kind of going to be ripped underneath us. And I really feel it's a kind of situation where, yes, what we have with the EU currently isn't good enough, but that doesn't mean we should accept something far worse to get there. And yes, we need a much more progressive society, but nothing at the moment shows that accepting Brexit and going through with all this will help us actually achieve that aim. As I kind of mentioned earlier, the trade unions and the Labour Party are saying that they've admit, we can achieve the radical society and the policies that we want to see while still being part of the EU. And I think also, lots of the big beneficial changes in society that we've won, I mentioned some of these environmental things and workers' rights, have come from the left all across Europe working together and campaigning together. And again, that doesn't necessarily, that has happened for many years whilst we've been part of the EU, can still happen without it. As Another Europe is Possible, we've been meeting with lots of our kind of counter organisations and groups all across Europe, different political parties. We've been having conferences with them, organising with them. And I definitely, like Jonathan, we want to see a much more kind of internationalist society that works together. But yeah, the leaving the EU doesn't do anything, I'd say, that necessarily take steps towards that, and the short-term cost is just too great, and it's just too big a gamble, I think, to play with people's lives, that to say that this will kind of create enough of a crisis that allows us to make the shift into creating this better progressive society that we want to see.
I suppose, is that not kind of the crux of it as well, Jonathan, is that if the left, we can say what we like about forging this wonderful utopian new society that is going to lead to mass redistribution of wealth, all these policies, blah, blah, blah. And that without EU shackles, being part of this neoliberal trading bloc, essentially, it's much more possible to do that. But I suppose, your analysis is that this is a British state in crisis, that this represents an opportunity. And I suppose, I think even, listeners who haven't been following or analysing it in that much depth would probably recognise that, and can see how precarious the situation is given the forces that led to Scottish independence and Brexit and all these things, and also the rise of Corbyn as well. Things are obviously very unstable and in a very sort of, there's a peculiar dynamic. But is it not kind of, and I don't want to get too abstract here, is there not kind of this Marxist kind of view here that you look at things through these great building blocks of through time, you know, we're at this stage, almost how Lenin would have seen things. We have to get to this point, and to get to this point, we must facilitate it in this way. Is it not? Are we not reaching a point where, as Kirsty puts it, we are just throwing people under the bus for something that is incredibly hypothetical and not really achievable anytime soon?
Well, I think the last few words of your question there are the problem when it comes to the left in the UK today. The left has suffered decades of defeat, but now I think things are changing. With Corbyn, with the independence movement of 2014, there is clearly movements of people that want to oppose the system and that want radical social and economic change. Now, it's not my position, let me be clear about this, is not that crisis automatically leads to change. That's not what I'm arguing. What I'm arguing is that the political crisis in Europe is permanent. It's not going away. And that the left has to get to grips with this. Either we're going to intervene within that so that we can resolve the crisis on our own terms, or we're going to rehabilitate the institutions which have led to the crisis in the first place. So if you take migration, for example, the EU, in my opinion, is going to become much, much harsher when it comes to migration. We can tell this because Tony Blair, who is very connected in with the EU, who without any democratic mandate is having discussions with the EU right now, wants to reform freedom of movement. You have Hillary Clinton, who is also a key figure in the centre, who has said the same thing as Tony Blair when it comes to migration in Europe. Macron is under huge pressure domestically at home, and so they're going to become more authoritarian, more right-wing and more racist. That's what's going to happen with the EU settlement. Now, there is an argument that says, well, the best option though is to remain inside in hopes and with a strategy that we can reform it. And what I'm saying is that the reason that the EU was set up in the first place, that the single market was set up in the first place, was deliberately to oppose and to prevent these kinds of movements from having any success. When you talk about throwing people under a bus, just very lastly, if you look at Greece, where I was there for the election of Syriza, where people couldn't eat, there were solidarity kitchens set up because people couldn't afford food, not to mention electricity and so on. And the EU's answer was to have more austerity. So the EU are very good at throwing people under a bus, whether it's migrants in the Mediterranean, whether it's the people of Greece, whether it's democratic decisions that are made elsewhere. And therefore, neither the British state nor the European Union holds the solution to this question. We need a left that can intervene within that context, is my argument.
I suppose I kind of want to talk a little bit more about Scotland here as well, because obviously people will be listening to this. Maybe some people will be screaming, but Scotland voted Remain and we're being dragged off a cliff edge. I think we've heard a lot of that kind of rhetoric, I suppose from SNP politicians, but also from Scottish politicians in other parties and other groups, because I suppose there is a very legitimate concern that Scotland hasn't been heard, particularly on Brexit. And I suppose that is true, Kirsty. We did vote significantly to Remain in 2016. One thing I suppose that some, not obviously this is very dependent what your views are on independence, but there are some who would say if you are prioritising that, or you're prioritising an independent Scotland within the EU, aligning yourself with the forces that are behind this so-called people's vote or a second referendum is actually harmful, because if it is the case that we can sort of rejig and come back on a question like Brexit, there's arguably nothing stopping that on Scottish independence down the line, should there be an eventual yes vote. So I suppose my question is, how would kind of renovating the kind of consensus of the British establishment, how does that strengthen a country like Scotland, which feels like it's been ignored in this process?
Yeah, so I suppose it's been kind of interesting that there are definitely some people who are very worried about a referendum on the Brexit deal will undermine a referendum on independence. But I suppose I have varying kind of opinions on that. You know, that's the fact that the main political parties in Scotland who want independence all advocate for a referendum on the Brexit deal just shows that that is kind of nonsense. No believes that's true. But there's also kind of various other things. I think it's very funny that, if you want independence in Scotland, what you're advocating for is another referendum on Scottish independence. You want a second referendum on independence, which is what we're arguing for in terms of Brexit, but one where there's kind of much more plans and much what's happening. So, I think it's quite funny that a lot of the people saying, there shouldn't be a second independence on Brexit because that'll undermine an independence referendum, are calling for another referendum on independence. But I think there's also, there's no reason actually why a referendum on Europe would do anything to undermine the case for independence in Scotland. Jacob Rees-Mogg today was saying that in fact actually if we had a second referendum in Europe, that would be very dangerous because it would mean there would almost certainly have to be the case for a second referendum on independence. So that's the Tories admitting that it would be very beneficial for the independence case because it would put this on the table. But also in terms of independence, I think if we had a vote on independence and then a few years down the line it became very clear that the sort of independence we were going to get was massively right-wing, it didn't do anything to achieve the more progressive society we wanted to see, it put all the people who I disagreed with on the winning side, then I would also, I think, want to be able to reconsider and rethink about that. You wouldn't want to see an independent Scotland, regardless of what that looked like and in terms of what the material conditions were. And I think that also has to be considered when we look at this.
I mean, Jonathan, you're obviously, you were part of the Radical Independence campaign setting that up. And I suppose, as someone who is in favour of independence quite resolutely, how you kind of square that circle? Scotland clearly voted for Remain. Polls suggest that if we had another vote, that would probably increase. And it wasn't just most of Scotland voted for him; it was every single constituency across class. That obviously there was variations, but that seemed to be the case almost everywhere. I suppose why would the pro-independence sort of element of the Scottish left, and even I suppose the parts of the Labour left that at least respect Scotland's right to self-determination and the right to hold another vote, why would they support pursuing Brexit as it is when essentially surely only an independence referendum can be justified if the argument is that its democratic voice hasn't been heard on this issue?
The critical difference between calling for a second EU referendum and a second independence one is that one has a mandate and one doesn't. I believe that mandates are necessary for referendums to be held for a whole variety of reasons. Now, in 2016, the SNP won at a general election a mandate to call a referendum if Scotland was taken out of the EU against its will. I believe that mandate is intact, it's democratically voted for, and it should be deployed now. I think it should be deployed now because it's at this moment where the British state itself is in most disarray, and where I think the democratic argument is not just about Brexit, but is a democratic argument that applies to Scotland, where its deficit on democracy is widespread, whether that's what government rules in Scotland that Scotland didn't vote for, whether it's the Tories, whether it's Brexit, whether it's any number of things. So mandates are important when it comes to referendums, and it's also important just to underline that by saying that the history of referendums internationally is that they have been deployed by elites to change the debate on a question, to interrupt opposition to the government, all of these kinds of things. If we get into a situation where referendums can be called without a party winning an election on that basis, with that in their manifesto, we then open the door to political elites and others being able to deploy referendums for their own means and to their own ends. That's a very dangerous place to go. So I respect people who are calling for a second referendum, though I disagree with it, but I would argue that without a mandate won at a general election, you open the door to some very dangerous consequences.
Just over the next sort of 15 minutes or so. I think both Jonathan and Kirsty, you both have obviously a lot of analysis here that actually, I suppose, overlaps here. And I suppose it's tricky because at this point there's a need for the left to be quite resolute and firm in what it's demanding, especially if it means pressuring Labour to do the right thing or the SNP to do the right thing. So I suppose I kind of want to see where there's consensus here where the agreement is, and I suppose what would perhaps be useful for people listening who are on the left and want to affect change in some way and be campaigning for the, for the right option, especially when that seems so hazy. I'm going to see how we can kind of come about this. I mean, first of all, what would you say, Kirsty, is areas here of Shafi's analysis, first of all, that you 100% agree with, why you deviate from it, and I hope this isn't too many questions in one, what that means going forward as a kind of unified left strategy?
That is a big question that kind of goes back over all the questions again. So I suppose in terms of the analysis, I mean, I agree with a lot of the reasons as to why kind of Brexit came about the way it is, and I think both of us have a very kind of similar vision in the sort of society that we want to see. We want to see a rise in kind of movements all across Europe, but not just across Europe, across the world, where we're uniting the left far more. It's far more integrated. It's working together to fight these forces and fight the rise of the far right. I suppose we kind of differ on how we think that should, what are the most immediate steps and how that should happen and what comes about from that. The various kind of, I suppose, when I've been talking about the short-termism around these things, and to some extent I think actually a lot of the kind of the Lexit positions and what Shafi's talking about are in many ways to some extent quite accelerationist on how they look at it. I think that when you try and look at the kind of Lexit picture overall, there's no way in which we can talk about what happens in the next few years and with the working class and working people and families, and in terms of when we look at the environment and things that are happening that makes this sit in any sort of comfortable circumstance. Far too much has to be given up when we look at what we want to see. And I think, when we think about the sort of Europe that we want to see and the sort of world that we want to see, we can achieve those things at the moment, and we need to be fighting for and talking about these things. And one of the things that I think not all Lexiters and we could agree on, but people like Jonathon and I definitely agree on, and I think there needs to be far more, is that kind of no matter way which any of this goes, one of the most important things is the issue of migration and freedom of movement being respected. And, sadly that isn't the case, as say for all Lexiters, but I think it is the case with us, and I would like to see it the case far more, something that's talked about, that is really what we push for, that migration and the issues of fighting these things is super important, and that can be done together, kind of no matter which way this ends up going, and needs to be one of the most important things that happens.
So I suppose a key thing coming out of that is, whatever I suppose the outcome of the process is, that the left needs to be unified and speaking with one voice on something like migration, especially if the far right, whatever side that may come from, utilises this issue and tries to use it in a similar way that we saw in 2016. I suppose getting past that as well, is there any areas of consensus, Jonathon, in terms of what comes next even before then, in terms of, 'cause I suppose we've got an idea that Labour are going to trigger a vote of no confidence in the government at some point. This may well be dependent on how the voting of confidence in Theresa May herself goes. That's speaking extremely short term, but in terms of what could come out of that, a general election is a very, very real option. In those circumstances, do you think there's a unified sort of left position? Do you think that's something that is there scope there for cross collaboration?
Well, I mean, first of all, Kirsty and I have worked on lots of different campaigns. Most recently, we were two of the key organisers of the anti-Trump demonstrations when it came to the UK recently and to Scotland. So when it comes to those kinds of events, when it comes to the things that Kirsty's outlined in terms of migration and all of the social and class questions, then there is all kinds of avenues to be working together. There is, though, going to be an ongoing and intensifying debate about the core of the strategy that the left's going to adopt and pursue, not just over Brexit, but in the years ahead. My conviction is that it has to be absolutely independent of the neoliberal institutions and of course of the far right. I think the EU will punish any serious radical left government that tries to assert itself. We hear that within the regulations you could adopt radical policies. The truth of the matter is this has rarely been tested, and it's my conviction that the EU has been set up to prevent these kinds of reforms taking place, that it's going to become more authoritarian and more right-wing to try and reassert itself when you look at what's happening across Europe. So it's also worth just tacking on at the end that the left, when it comes to this, I would accept that in many ways I'm in a minority, but the left is not united on this. But neither are the Tory party, nor the Labour Party, nor the mainstream of the British ruling class. Lots of whom, if you look at the CBI, the big banks and Goldman Sachs and all that, they're all behind May's deal. But others like Tony Blair want a complete rerun of the referendum. Paralysis has set in the political system because those forces which were dominant are now fragmenting. Now, I'm not an accelerationist, which means that you want to intensify a crisis because you have some fantastical belief that the outcome will fall to the left. That's not my politics, it's not my position. My position is that the crisis is a fact, that it's not going to wane, that it's going to intensify, and that in that, the most fundamental and valuable thing that the left can have is its political independence. That means it has to oppose the EU and the British state, and it has to stand on its own 2 feet, advocating solutions which go well beyond the neoliberal institutions, which, as I've said, are going to become much more authoritarian, less democratic, and more right-wing.
Do you want to quickly come back on that, Kirsty, or just any final thoughts?
I suppose just quite quickly, one of the things that Jonathon keeps talking about is that we need to have our own independent position and our own independent thing, which in theory, kind of sounds good and interesting, but what does that actually mean and what does that actually look like? Us leaving the EU doesn't get rid of the EU. It still exists. All the other countries across Europe are still part of it. It's still an institution that the rest of the left across Europe still are involved in, make part of, and organise through and out with. And I suppose, this independent thing that you want to see, what is that and how do we get there?
Well, my opinion about this is that you have two things at the same time happening. You have an exit from the European Union, not through a set of politics which I agree with, but that's a political fact, and that you have a radical left-wing Labour leader on 40% in the polls, which doesn't exist anywhere else across Europe, and that in combination, these two things are a huge opportunity for the left, and not just for the left in the UK, but because I believe that should the UK come out of the entanglement of the European apparatus, should it be able to implement via Corbyn a radical transformative economic programme, then that is a true beacon to the left across Europe. And what it says is that there's a possibility of dismantling the European Union and of constructing new institutions which actually work for the people, which are democratic, and which can actually face the challenges of the 21st century. Now, that may seem like it's a very difficult road, and I have no hesitation to say that that will involve large-scale political struggle in order to get to that point. But equally, the route that's being suggested by those who are left-wing and who want to remain is a very difficult road as well. We would be going back into the European institutions, and I do want to reinforce this point. Those people in the establishment are looking at the situation just now and thinking we must never let these things happen again. They will come hard against the left, hard against Corbyn, hard against the left across the whole of Europe. That's what those institutions are there for. So either way, it's very difficult. I accept that. I accept that my proposals are not easy, but I would just say and suggest that no one, no political force has got a solution that doesn't have grave and serious and important consequences which we have to discuss. But I think it's an important position to be advocating, because if this argument isn't won over Brexit, my position, then it's going to have to be one further down the line, because the institutions which run European capitalism are going to come into conflict with the left. And that conflict's going to happen. Whether it's with Brexit or anything else, it's unavoidable, and therefore we have to take up a position right now which is opposed to those institutions.
I suppose, just closing then, do you have any sort of final thoughts first of all, Kirsty? I suppose the arguments Jonathan's put forward. I suppose just respond quickly to those, but also just any sort of final statement you wish to make.
Look, we're in the situation we're in at the moment, and I think that what we're looking at is a situation that is going to make the lives worse for most people across Britain in terms of Brexit going ahead and happening. And whilst we want to see a lot of good changes that can happen to society, we can still do those things. We can still fight for and should do those things. And those changes that we want to see be made in society aren't made easier by leaving Brexit. In fact, in many cases, if we rip up society and make lives worse for people in Britain, that is shown to be in so many cases, that is some of the most fertile breeding ground for the far right, when you have kind of society in crisis and austerity and all of these things that looks like Brexit is going to do to us. So I think we really need to be clear about kind of where we are, what this means, and the sort of Brexit that we're getting. Lots of the arguments that Jonathan and people across the kind of the Lexit spectrum put forward, if we weren't in the middle of the debate and this wasn't where the deal is and where we're at now, if we were having a kind of hypothetical debate in question around Brexit, a lot of them I think could have a lot of merit, but that's not looking at the kind of real life situation we're in now and what this means for people. I think we have to be clear that the situation we're in at the moment, Brexit is worse for people's lives. Brexit isn't going to help us win the kind of campaigns and things that we want to achieve in society. And in light of that, what we have to be arguing for is a referendum. And we have to be going out and arguing to win that referendum. We have to be standing up for migrants across communities. We have to be fighting for better kind of environmental rights. We have to be winning these fights and these struggles in the long term. And in the short term, one of the things that we have to be doing to help make that happen is by fighting Brexit.
And just finally then, Jonathan, really, really briefly, do you have anything sort of to close that you'd like to say?
Well, there's no left-wing option if there is another referendum. If Remain wins, it will win by a small majority. That will unleash a huge movement of the far right, which will have an electoral base. And at the same time as that, if Remain wins, it won't be another Europe is possible that will be in charge of what happens next. The centre will reassert itself. They will attack Corbyn. That is not a good outcome for the left. And all we will have done is reinforced the institutions of neoliberalism and at the same time cut ourselves off from intervening in the broader working class. That's my argument. Equally, if there's a referendum and it votes again to leave, then I think that the consequences of that, of course, are obvious. But it's my view that the arguments for leaving the EU on a left-wing basis are actually now more competent. The reason for that is because the ERG and Jacob Rees-Mogg's mob, I think, are a busted flush. I think May's a busted flush. I think the only argument that works with Brexit is one that involves huge state investment, and only the left can deliver that. And very lastly, and in closing, the referendum that's being pursued by another Europe is possible, I think does have some serious democratic faults with it. There are three options, but most people could leave the EU and we'd end up remaining in the EU. So there's lots to think about.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Kirsty and Jonathan, for joining me. We probably could talk a lot longer than what's been just under an hour. Our studio time's coming to an end, so we need to move on. On Conter, we probably will be continuing this discussion through various means, and we invite people to contribute their thoughts and pitch and all the rest of it. For now, this is our last podcast of the year. Thank you to everybody who's listened to this one and the Labour one as well, and read all our stuff and shared and all that kind of thing in 2018, and 2017 as well. Merry Christmas to all, and thank you for listening.